Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Crimea lost, Russia's stronghold collapses, and with it falls one of the most powerful symbols of modern territorial conquest. For years, Crimea stood as proof of Russian dominance, a fortified peninsula declared permanently secured and untouchable. Its collapse marks a seismic shift in the Russia-Ukraine war, a moment that reshapes not only the battlefield but the psychology of power, occupation, and resistance. What once appeared irreversible has unraveled, not through a single dramatic blow, but through sustained pressure, brutal battles, and the slow erosion of control that no fortress can survive when its foundations crack. Crimea's importance cannot be overstated. It is not merely land, it is leverage. Situated in the Black Sea, the peninsula anchors naval power, controls key maritime routes, and projects influence far beyond its coastline. When Russia seized Crimea in 2014, the move stunned the world. It was swift, calculated, and backed by a narrative of inevitability. Ukrainian forces were caught unprepared. International responses were cautious, and within weeks, Crimea was absorbed into Russian administration. Moscow invested heavily, transforming the peninsula into a military citadel. Air defense systems blanketed the skies, naval bases expanded, missile platforms dotted the coastline, and tens of thousands of troops rotated through. Crimea became the crown jewel of Russia's southern strategy, a place where defeat was considered impossible. For Ukraine, the loss of Crimea was a national trauma. It was a reminder of vulnerability and a wound that never healed. Yet, even as the years passed and the occupation hardened, Ukraine never accepted Crimea's loss as final. Officially, politically, and culturally, the peninsula remained Ukrainian. The challenge was timing. Attempting to retake Crimea prematurely would have meant catastrophic losses. Ukraine needed to survive first, then adapt, then grow stronger. The war elsewhere forced rapid evolution. Each battle taught lessons. Each setback demanded innovation. Over time, Ukraine transformed its military, its intelligence capabilities, and its coordination with allies. What began as survival became preparation. As the broader war intensified, Crimea shifted from distant symbol to strategic objective. Ukrainian planners understood that the peninsula's strength was also its weakness. Crimea is not self-sustaining. It depends on supply routes, bridges, ports, and air corridors. Sever those, and the fortress suffocates. Rather than launching a reckless assault, Ukraine began shaping the battlefield patiently. Precision strikes targeted logistics hubs, ammunition depots, radar installations, and command centers. Each strike was a message. Crimea was no longer safe. The war was coming home. At first, Russian authorities dismissed these attacks as isolated incidents. Official statements spoke of accidents and minor sabotage, but soldiers on the ground knew better. Explosions deep inside the peninsula shattered the illusion of invulnerability. Supply convoys became targets. Bases once considered rear areas moved to constant alert. Morale, built on the promise of safety, began to crack. The occupation had relied not only on weapons, but on belief. As that belief eroded, so did control. The battles that followed were relentless and often brutal. Ukraine did not seek spectacle, it sought pressure. Geography became a weapon. Bridges, ports, and rail lines that connected Crimea to mainland Russia became choke points. Each disruption multiplied the effect of the last. Fuel shortages emerged. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. Russian forces found themselves isolated, operating in an increasingly hostile environment with shrinking options. Air and sea dominance, once Russia's advantage, became contested. Air defense systems were degraded through repeated strikes and deception, forcing aircraft to fly higher, farther, or not at all. At sea, naval assets faced unprecedented threats, limiting resupply and mobility. The Black Sea, long dominated by Russia, became dangerous. Every movement carried risk. What had been a secure logistical network turned fragile and unpredictable. Psychological warfare amplified the physical battles. Ukrainian messaging was direct and persistent. Crimea would be liberated. Resistance was not forgotten. For Russian troops, many already questioning the purpose of the war, this message was corrosive. Being stationed in Crimea, once considered prestigious, became stressful and isolating. Constant alerts, fear of strikes, and uncertainty about resupply drained morale. Units grew weary, discipline weakened, and desertions increased. Control depends on confidence, and confidence was slipping away. Civilians lived through their own ordeal. Years of occupation brought surveillance, repression, and forced conformity. The renewed fighting added danger and fear, but also something else, hope. Underground networks quietly shared information. Movements were tracked. Intelligence flowed despite risks. The occupation had promised stability, but delivered isolation and militarization. As Ukrainian pressure mounted, many residents began to believe liberation was possible. Occupation breeds resistance, even when silence is enforced. The collapse of Russian control did not come from a single catastrophic defeat. It came from accumulation. Each failed resupply, each degraded system, each delayed decision added weight. Russian command faced impossible choices. Reinforce Crimea and weaken other fronts, or hold elsewhere and risk losing the peninsula. Internal disagreements, overconfidence, and slow responses compounded the crisis. The very militarization meant to protect Crimea became a liability. Concentrated forces became concentrated targets. When the decisive phase arrived, it was marked by intensity rather than drama. Urban areas saw fierce fighting as Ukrainian forces advanced cautiously, aware of civilian presence and infrastructure. Rural terrain offered fewer hiding places, exposing positions to precision fire. Night operations, drones, electronic warfare, and constant reconnaissance defined the battles. This was modern warfare at its most unforgiving, where control depended on information as much as firepower. Russian units began to fracture. Communication broke down. Orders conflicted or arrived too late. Some positions were abandoned without resistance, not because weapons were lacking, but because will was gone. Others fought fiercely, but without coordination or support. Surrenders increased, withdrawals turned chaotic. The occupation unraveled not in a single moment, but in a series of irreversible failures. A fortress does not fall all at once. It collapses piece by piece. When Ukrainian forces finally secured Crimea, the significance was overwhelming. Flags raised across the peninsula symbolized more than victory. They marked the end of a narrative that began in 2014 with shock and humiliation. For Ukraine, Crimea's return was proof that patience, sacrifice, and unity could overcome even the most entrenched occupation. For Russia, it was a devastating blow to prestige and credibility. The idea of irreversible conquest was shattered. Internationally, the shockwaves were immediate. Allies who supported Ukraine saw confirmation that their assistance mattered. Nations watching from the sidelines reassessed assumptions about power and deterrence. Military analysts rewrote conclusions drawn years earlier. Crimea's collapse demonstrated that fortified positions can fail when isolated. that morale matters as much as hardware, and that time can favor the defender who refuses to surrender identity. Yet victory brought responsibility. Brutal battles left scars across the peninsula. Infrastructure damage displaced civilians, and deep social wounds demanded careful attention. Ukraine faced the challenge of restoring governance while ensuring security and justice. The task was not only to win the war, but to win the peace. Healing would take time. Rebuilding trust would require restraint. Liberation was the beginning of a new chapter, not its conclusion. For Ukrainians, Crimea's return became a defining national moment. It validated years of sacrifice and endurance. Soldiers who fought across distant fronts saw their efforts vindicated. Families separated by occupation glimpsed reunion. Sovereignty became tangible, not symbolic. Ukraine emerged not only as a survivor, but as a nation capable of reversing loss through resilience and strategy. Crimea lost, Russia's stronghold collapses will be studied for decades. Military academies will analyze the strategy. Historians will debate the turning points. Political leaders will draw lessons about power, patience, and miscalculation. Above all, it will stand as a reminder that occupation breeds resistance, that force cannot erase identity, and that even the strongest fortresses depend on belief to endure. As the dust settles over the Black Sea, one truth stands clear. This was not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. The collapse of Crimea shattered myths of permanence and exposed the limits of domination through fear. History has shown again that borders imposed by force are fragile, and that time favors those who refuse to accept loss as final. Crimea's fall is no longer speculation or rhetoric. It is reality, and its echoes will shape the future of this war and the world beyond it.